Welcome to this lecture on gender, a tool of historical analysis. In this lecture, we would be talking about how history can be understood as a narrative of power. Most of the written records are self-conscious products and are closely tied to those who have experienced and exercised power. Examples, one can talk about the Raj Tarangini, the Harsh Charita or the Itihas portions of the Puranas. These are all unambiguous narratives of power. And when we are talking about ancient Indian sources, then we can say that there are not all non-conventional historical sources, but most of them fall in the category of non-conventional historical sources. There are a variegated collection of Brahmanical sources, Vedas, Upanishads, Brahmanas, Aranyakas, then a series of myths, religious texts and other types of literary productions which are considered as the source material or the reference material for writing ancient Indian history. The textual sources are the products of a knowledge system which was highly monopolistic, hierarchical, and thus it was narrowly concentrated in the hands of a few men. And this is the core problem that historians face while writing about ancient Indian history, because most of the textual sources have been the products of a knowledge system which was completely dominated and controlled by upper caste men. So, having outlined the problems that exist pertaining to ancient Indian sources which have kind of posed grave challenge to knowing more about women in ancient India, now we would talk about what are the alternatives to Brahmanical sources. So, when we are talking about alternatives, we can talk about some of the Buddhist sources, the Jatakas or the Panchatantra. They give a different kind of evidence on women, and also they talk about the lower orders, because Buddhism and Jainism they had kind of opened their doors and there was no caste hierarchy that was prevalent as far as these religions were concerned. So, there exists a rich repertoire of narratives and often describe these most of these narratives, they often describe the experiences of ordinary women and men with great poignancy. So, they are firmly located within a Buddhist worldview, and they are kind of a different kind of a projection as compared to the so-called Brahmanical sources. So, there is a lot of Buddhist monastic influence also on most of these sources like Jatakas, Panchatantra, etc. Jatakas are basically the product of mediations between the high culture and the low culture, and most of these Jatakas were framed by the Buddhist monks, that is the bhikkhus, as they were leading a monastic life. Here one can talk about a very special kind of source that has largely been discussed by several feminist scholars like Uma Chakravarti. For example, Theri Gatha. What were these Theri Gathas? These Theri Gathas were the verses or the songs of the bhikkhunis, So, while Jatakas have been ascribed to bhikkhus, Theri Gathas have been ascribed to the Buddhist nuns, and this was a work that is probably one of the earliest compilations of women's poetry anywhere in the world. This not only constitutes a very interesting kind of source material for understanding past, but it also gives lot of scope for evolving a gender narrative pertaining to ancient Indian history. Now next one can talk about as to how history writing appeared during the colonial past and the kind of colonial historiography, the kind of influence colonial historiography had on the theme of gender. So when we are talking about colonial historiography, we have to talk about Orientalists. And how the Orientalists during the course of 19th century, they developed an interest in ancient Indian history, and they kind of projected and reconstructed the greatness of Indian civilization as a part of romanticism to know the unknown. So most of the British administrators kind of developed interest in Indian mythology, Indian religion, literature, Vedas, and all this was projected as in a very romanticized way in order to highlight the glory of ancient Indian past, and also to justify, the presence of British rule, as to how Britishers were able to rule this once so great country. And in this endeavor, past was presented as a homogeneous whole without any distortion. So the same kind of anomaly that later on appeared in most of the nationalist historians, the beginnings had been made by the Orientalists, where India's past was projected as a homogeneous in a society, and in this homogeneous society the category of women was not really dissected into the rich or the poor or the upper caste or the lower caste, and the past was projected as a whole. Now Orientalists like William Jones and H.T. Colebrook, who were associated with the Asiatic Society, they raised the themes of Sanskrit literature, history, philosophy, and Max Muller collected and published the full text of the Vedas, and Max Muller declared Vedas to be the natural basis of Indian history and Aryans as the true ancestors of European race. So all this was being done with a hidden agenda to project some kind of a connection, in the past between the ancient Indians, the Aryans, and how ultimately it was logical for Britishers to rule over India due to that connection in the past. Now in this entire discourse, women were not regarded as worth getting mentioned because the Orientalist account was more focused in highlighting, as I just told you, broad generalizations. So with few exceptions like the Maitreyi and the Yagnavalkya debate, there was hardly any explanation provided for the very important role played by women in Indian society. There were different modes of surplus appropriation and intermediary identities that were consciously avoided, because the aim was to project a very simplistic, high sounding and a great past, and in that the different modes of surplus appropriation, the exploitation of the marginalized castes and classes, and especially evolution of patriarchy, all this was conveniently glossed over. And the British agenda was to focus on making the natives understand their obsolete past and also applaud the efforts Britishers were making in making Indians aware of their past. Then Orientalists' dependence for their sources was more on the religious textual material, and most of this religious textual material was Brahmanical in origin, with a few exceptions, as I just told you about Jatakas and Panchatantra, etc., or Theri Gathas, which were not really looked into by the colonial administrators. So the kind of image of woman that emerged out of these various sources which colonialists were referring to was that of a virtuous woman. The texts viewed women mainly in the context of the family, domesticity, and they showed the inherent bias of the Brahmins rather than the actual practice of the people. So, rather than taking into account the day-to-day lives of the people, what they focused more on was the Brahmanical writings and a deep regard for the image of a virtuous woman. So, the insistence on female purity and virtues became absolute, and there was no going back to that. Then the British administrators and intellectuals like James Mill, who was a British historian, economist, political theorist, wrote the history of British India. And now here comes a different approach altogether to history writing or to describing ancient Indian past. And this was the approach to criticize ancient Indian civilization in order to justify the existence of British rule. So, James Mill declared Indian civilization to be very degraded due to the status of Indian women and also due to the exploitation of the lower orders. So, here we see a complete reversal from the Orientalist standpoint, where a different kind of approach was being adopted to highlight ancient Indian past in negative terms so as to justify the continuity of British rule. So, what emerged was a critique of Indian civilization. So, Indian civilization excluded women from sacred texts, it deprived them of education, it deprived them of political power, a share in paternal property, and also it considered them unworthy to even sit or eat along with their husbands. So, these were the kind of facts that were explored from the past, and they were brought out in the public domain, and several explanations were given as to why India needs just rulers like the Britishers who are going to give Indian women their due. So, Indian women would be educated, they would be given equal rights, they would be made to participate in the public sphere, and so therefore, this was a kind of justification that India needed rulers like the Britishers who were just and who were not unjust like the ancient Indian rulers or the ancient Indian family system. So, the British administrators justified presence of the British Raj in India as Indian men were unfit for self-rule. And why were they considered as unfit for self-rule? Because this was the kind of bad treatment that they had been given, giving to their wives, to the female members of their family. And it is in this background that I would like to discuss about another bestseller that appeared during this period. And the name of this bestseller was Mother India. Mother India that appeared in 1927 was written by Catherine Mayo. This was a detailed account of the sexual excesses of Indian men over child bride and also the suffering of the child bride. The theme of this work was to bring forward the kind of centuries old suffering that Indian women or rather girls had experienced at the hands of Indian men who were kind of brandished as very exploitative, cruel, and the kind of sexual excesses that they indulged in was compared to that of animal instinct. Now, the writing soon became a bestseller, and it served the colonial interest also of justifying the existence of colonial rule over Indians. So, the writing definitely became a trendsetter of sorts, and it highlighted the kind of problems that had existed in Indian society for so long, and how Indian men were just not able to control themselves, and so therefore they needed the might of British regime in order to put things in order. Now, rejection of the demand for Swaraj or the self-government also was at the was also one of the core strategy that had been devised by the colonial administrators, because this was the time when the demand for Swaraj was being raised, and there were the extremist leaders who were kind of demanding more representation. They were questioning the influence of Britishers, the unjust influence of Britishers, and this was the right way of nipping that demand in bud by saying that Indians are not even fit for self-rule, so how can you even talk about that? Look at the way you have treated your women for so many centuries. Then Clarice Bader, who wrote Women in Ancient India, projected women as spiritual, ascetic and completely devoted to family, ever ready to perform sati. Now this was a different an altogether different way of projecting Indian women and trying to describe them as very happily performing sati and ever ready to be the spiritual ascetic once their husbands had died. So there was some kind of discrepancy, I would say, in colonial writings, and they would write whatever suited their own agenda. So definitely in this kind of framework, it was not the right kind of history that was being written, or a gender sensitive historical narrative was not something that was even being attempted. Now, what was the approach of British historians towards medieval period? Here again, there was a faulty portrayal of medieval period as a dark age. Medieval period came to be projected as the harbinger of various evils of Indian society like child marriage, parda, sati, to create a false notion of the earlier era being a golden age. And this approach was not only followed by the colonial administrators in order to again justify their presence on the Indian scene, but also by several nationalist historians who kind of projected the medieval period as a dark age and the ancient civilization as the glorious period, as the golden age. And as they were raising their voice against the British rule, against the excesses of the colonial regime, they kind of looked at that ancient past as their ultimate savior, and their aim was, the aim of Indian revolutionaries and nationalist scholars was to take India back to that old golden era. Now, in the course of all this discussion, what was emerging was how illusion was something so different from reality, and the neglect of gender as an analytical category generated ill-founded notions about women, and they were looked down upon when they wielded power on the basis of their merit. And here we have a number of examples that were that one can talk about even for medieval period. For example, Razia Sultan, who was criticized for being born in the wrong sex by Minhaj uz Siraj, and similarly Noor Jahan, who played such an important and crucial role not only as the wife of Jahangir, but also as a very strong lady who kind of took care of administration, trade, fashion, of the empire during a very crucial juncture. And Noor Jahan was represented as power hungry and manipulative. So therefore, this difference between illusion and reality continued. Now coming to nationalist history, the kind of nationalist history that was being written and how it projected Indian women. Nationalist history dominated the scene until the late 1950s, and it largely focused on political history, that is the history of kings, dynasties, the great Guptas, Mauryas, Kushanas, etc., then the conquests, the invasions, and also the various political institutions. These were talked about in detail by the nationalist historians in order to project ancient Indian past as highly developed, as belonging to the golden era. Then they also carried forward what one can describe as the cultural history, because they were obsessed with locating and outlining idealized images and golden eras. So this idealization of the past not only projected faulty history writing, but it also gave incomplete picture, and a picture in which women had no identity. So a conscious steering away from examining internal contradictions, divisions, caste hierarchies, gender hierarchies, and oppressive structures, all these were carried forward with great conviction by most of the nationalist historians. And the idea that was being conveyed was that how ancient Indian civilization had been so great, and these Britishers, they have no business questioning our existence or trying to control our identity through modernization and westernization. Here you can give examples of several works by R.K. Mukherjee, R.C. Majumdar and K.P. Jaiswal among others. Then the series of volumes that were edited by R.C. Majumdar, titled The Indian History and Culture, and published by the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan between 1956 to 1963, definitely fall in that genre. Now post 1980s, there has been a shift in history writing, and now you can say that there was a renewed emphasis on history, on writing history of powerless. And who were these powerless? They were the subalterns, that is belonging to the marginalized sections of society, the lower castes, working class, laboring class, as well as scheduled castes and so on and so forth. So this connection between gender structures, ideologies and social and economic power structures became the core strategy of history writing post 1980s. And the trend was on exploring the history of the lower orders, such as the Das Karamkaras, as they were called in ancient India, and then the Shudras, and the whole emphasis was on bringing in issues of caste and class, as well as unequal power relations. However, the only exception that remained even during this phase of subaltern history writing was some kind of neglect of unequal gender relations. So unequal gender relations still did not find a very clear mention in most of the subaltern studies, and this has also been identified as one of the limitations of subaltern studies. So most of the studies neglected women as a category, while women were brought into the frame of history, but that was as the subaltern class. The lives and struggle of ordinary people like peasants and tribals was accounted for by the subaltern historians beautifully. There is no denying the fact. But women as a separate category within the subalterns, So, one can say subalterns within the subalterns were not really adequately talked about. Subaltern historians continued to focus on peasant men, tribal men, without even being conscious that women within the subalterns could be even far more exploited due to this overarching influence on their lives of domesticity and the social norms, cultural traditions which had been part of their psyche and life cycle for so long. So, their writing was as male centered as the earlier nationalist or Marxist historians' writings had been. A history of the powerless rather neglected the most powerless, as they remained outside the framework of the new historical trends that were emerging. However, there have been shifts in writing of women's history, and that is what is now more important and a positive way of looking at how things are changing and how the scenario of history writing has changed. As has been pointed out by Tanika Sarkar, women's movement of the 1970s which provided the right kind of context and an impetus also for the emergence of women's studies in India. There were a series of movements in 1970s, 1980s against rape, dowry, domestic violence, and all these movements in some way or the other provided the right kind of impetus for the emergence of women's studies in India, which has played a very crucial role in a new kind of history writing and in incorporating the gender perspective. Now, how is this new kind of history writing different from the preceding times? Firstly, everyday experiences are now being counted as history. So, to study the contours of the multiple forms and structures of patriarchies as well as the cultural practices associated with them, all this cannot be done simply by looking at archival records or simply by looking at inscriptions or simply by looking at archaeological sources. So, therefore, one needs to incorporate the experiences of women which might be buried somewhere in the theory gathas or in the poems or in the ballads, in the folk songs. So, therefore, by using several different kind of sources, which also could include folk literature and some other kind of non-traditional sources, gender has emerged as a category of analysis. And as one talks about feminist historiography, first major moves were made by feminist scholars who kind of dismantled the dominant nationalist narrative of the glory of womanhood during the ancient past, especially during the Vedic period. So, therefore, the beginnings have been made and feminist historiography has come on its own, and right at the onset they kind of challenged the narrative of the glory of womanhood during the ancient past that had been devised by the kind of Brahmanical literature that had been has been handed down to us as important source of ancient Indian period. Thanks a lot.